بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
To postulate a theory of the crucifixion that is both in agreement with the Quran as well as historically plausible within the paradigm of modern historiography. So it seems to me that a potential problem with the swoon theory from a Quranic standpoint is that it cannot be easily reconciled with the broader Quranic discourse. For example, we're told in the Quran, excuse me, that God will say to Jesus on the day of judgment, وَإِذْ كَفَفْتُ بَنِي إِسْرَائِيلَ عَنْكَ. Behold, I restrained the Israelites from harming you, right? And the verb kaffa in this verse is used seven other times in the Quran. And in every case, it means to restrain or avert from physical harm. So if Jesus was fastened to a cross with ropes or nails or both, after having been probably flogged and beaten, it seems doubtful that this would constitute being restrained from harm, right? Even if he never died. So it seems to me that the swoon theory doesn't quite work when we look at the Quran more comprehensively. And by the way, Psalm 20 verse 6 says that God will save his Messiah, right? Hoshia Adonai Mashiach, it says. God will save his Messiah. None of the Tanakhi passages that Christians claim are messianic explicitly mention the word Messiah, but Psalm 20 verse 6 does, and it says God will save his Messiah. And the verb is yasha in biblical Hebrew, which means to save from physical harm, just as kafna in Quranic Arabic does. Divine rapture from the cross also suffers, pun intended, from this same problem. A flogged, beaten, bleeding Jesus is very difficult to reconcile with these broader Quranic statements concerning him. It means to be raptured. In other words, both Paul and the gospel writers say that Jesus was killed by human agents on the cross, but they differ on the nature of the resurrection. The Pauline resurrection of Jesus is where the body stayed buried and appearances were in the form of visions. Paul never spoke of an empty tomb. That is a later development. I'll return to the empty tomb later, inshallah.
That's a good point. So, Paul said this has been noticed by biblical scholars that Paul doesn't mention the empty tomb at all, and this is it only appears in the much later Gospels written after AD 70. Mark being the earliest, of course. So it's actually not there in the first part of the first century. This idea is unknown.
It's not there, yeah. And we'll talk about Mark and the empty tomb narrative. All of these attributions turned out to be false. All of them. This is standard historical criticism. These Gospels and epistles are later writings that were either anonymously written or they are brazen forgeries where their authors are pretending to be apostles of Jesus and pretending to be eyewitnesses. In other words, the Quran is correct. The Quran made a statement 600 years after Jesus that turned out to be true according to the dominant view of modern historical critics. It took historians a few centuries.
Can I just to interrupt, just agreement with what you say, but I just want to emphasize that when you say this is the standard historical critical view, to my knowledge, most historians in this field are actually Christians in the United States and Germany and France and Britain. It's overwhelmingly Christian dominated. So, but people like Bart Ehrman are exceptions. He started off, of course, as a biblical scholar who was an evangelical. So he moved into atheism later in his career. The reason I mention that is what you've said is actually accepted by most scholars who are Christians to be the case. So we're not dealing here with hardened skeptics who hate Christianity. We're dealing here with committed Christians themselves. I mean, I mentioned a whole raft of names from Jimmy Dunn onwards, who do believe in the Trinity, but nevertheless acknowledge the historical evidence is so compelling to them to come to the conclusion, say the Gospels, for example, are not written by eyewitnesses. And the problem is most ordinary lay Christians, shall we say, who are not familiar with what their own scholars have been saying for a couple of centuries now, are unaware of this and continue to believe that Matthew, the Apostle Matthew, wrote Matthew, the Apostle John wrote John, etc., etc. So there's this huge gulf, this schism, which is well understood. That Bart Ehrman has references, other people, that most Christians are not educated, unfortunately, in basic historiography, which is practiced by their own scholars. So this is a real problem in terms of the scholarship for the Bible, actually. But anyway.
Right. Is there physical, forensic, or material evidence of Jesus's alleged crucifixion? Is there any material evidence of any Jew who was ever crucified by the Romans in ancient Palestine. Apparently, tens of thousands of Jews were crucified. And all archaeologists have ever found was a single heel bone of a man with a nail driven through it. They call him Yohanan. I don't know how they know his name, but that's what they call him. I think he just made it up. Tens of thousands apparently crucified, one heel, one nail. That's it. So either the numbers are greatly exaggerated, or the vast majority of the time, victims were tied to their crosses. And by the way, only the Gospel of John says that Jesus was nailed to the cross, and it's an implicit reference. Now, a Christian apologist might say at this point, but there is physical evidence of Jesus's crucifixion. What about all of these holy relics sprawled across the Christian world that provide material evidence of Jesus's crucifixion? What about the crown of thorns, the pieces of the true cross, the Shroud of Turin? Okay, so let's deal with these briefly because this is easy. So the so-called crown of thorns displayed at Notre Dame Cathedral in France, this only popped up in the 5th century before of the Common Era, 5th century CE. It is impossible to trace it back to 1st century Palestine, let alone back to Jesus of Nazareth, right? If Christians want to believe it's authentic because of a spiritual hunch or some feeling or insight, fine, but don't tell me it's valid historically. When it comes to the various pieces and splinters of the, quote, true cross, church leaders have been very hesitant to submit fragments for scientific testing, since testing is not only expensive, it also damages the relic. Perhaps more importantly, however, is the church's desire to preserve its reputation, especially since what happened in 2016. So a supposed fragment of the so-called true cross, venerated for 1,000 years at Waterford Cathedral in Ireland, was radiocarbon dated by researchers at Oxford in 2016. And the results were less than thrilling for the church. The fragment was dated to the 11th century of the Common Era.
Wow.
The most famous Christian relic by far is called the Sacro Sindon, or the Shroud of Turin. So the shroud first emerged in France in the middle of the 14th century and was almost immediately denounced as a fraud by the Bishop of Troyes. Nonetheless, the popularity and sort of the mystique of the shroud grew exponentially, especially when it was moved to Turin in Italy in 1578. It was radiocarbon dated by scientists at 3 different institutions in 1988, and all 3 tests determined a range between 1260 and 1390 CE with a 95% confidence. Today, the official position of the Catholic Church, a lot of people don't know this, but the official position of the Catholic Church is that the Shroud of Turin is a representation of Christ. Emphasis on the prefix representation. In other words, it's not an icon. In other words, it is an icon, not a relic. That's the official position. It's not a relic, okay? Not a relic, okay? And by the way, there are 2 scholars, Andrea Nicoletti and a man named, I think, Andrew Casper, who have done fantastic work on this topic. Conclusively, the Shroud of Turin has nothing to do with the historical Jesus of Nazareth. That's some hardcore damage control. The bottom line is that there is no direct evidence, no direct material evidence of Jesus's death by crucifixion. So who said Jesus was crucified? Well, the authors of the 4 Gospels, traditionally believed to be 2 disciples of Jesus and 2 disciples of the disciples, all stated clearly that Jesus was crucified by the Romans at the instigation of the Jewish leaders, and that he died on the cross. But here's the problem. According to a near consensus of New Testament scholars, both confessional and non-confessional, as we mentioned, the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John were anonymously written books that were later attributed to their supposed eponymous authors. These books were actually written between the years 70 and 100 CE, or plausibly later, by highly educated 3rd or 4th generation Greek-speaking Pauline Christians, not by the Aramaic-speaking disciples of Jesus, nor even the disciples of the disciples. In fact, it is very likely that the authors of the Gospels had no connection whatsoever with the original disciples. Furthermore, none of the Gospel authors claimed to be disciples or eyewitnesses to the events that they described. If the disciple Matthew wrote the Gospel of Matthew, it doesn't stand to reason that he would copy substantial portions of Mark's Gospel verbatim, especially since Mark never met Jesus. With respect to the book of Acts, I think it can be convincingly argued that it was mostly a work of historical fiction, as it plainly contradicts material found in the earlier Pauline corpus. And I mentioned in a previous podcast, the author of Acts clearly intended to present an idealized picture of the early church. It's revisionist history. It's written in the 2nd century that severely sanitizes the conflict between what we call Camp Paul on one side and Camp James/Peter on the other.
وبكفرهم وقولهم على مريم بهتانا عظيما وقولهم إنا قتلنا المسيح عيسى ابن مريم رسول الله وما قتلوه وما صلبوه ولكن شبه لهم وإن الذين اختلفوا فيه لفي شك منه ما لهم به من علم إلا اتباع الظن وما قتلوه يقينا بل رفعه الله إليه وكان الله عزيزا حكيما وإن من أهل الكتاب إلا ليؤمنن به قبل موته ويوم القيامة يكون عليهم شهيدا.
بعد المسيح لنا سؤال نريد جوابه ممن وعاه إذا مات الإله بصنع قوم أماتوه فما هذا الإله وهل أرضاه ما نالوه منه فبشراهم إذا نالوا رضاه وإن سخط الذي فعلوه فيه فقوتهم إذن أوهت قواه وهل بقي الوجود بلا إله سميع يستجيب لمن دعاه وهل خلت الطباق السبع لما ثوى تحت التراب وقد علاه وهل خلت العوالم من إله يدبرها وقد سمرت يداه وكيف تخلت الأملاك عنه بنصرهم وقد سمعوا بكاه وكيف أطاقت الخشبات حمل الإله الحق مشدودا قفاه وكيف دنا الحديد إليه حتى يخالطه ويلحقه أذاه وكيف تمكنت أيدي عداه وطالت حيث قد صفعوا قفاه وهل عاد المسيح إلى حياة أم المحيي له رب سواه ويا عجبا لقبر ضم ربا وأعجب منه بطن قد حواه أقام هناك 9 من شهور لدى الظلمات من حيض غذاه وشق الفرج مولودا صغيرا ضعيفا فاتحا للثدي فاه ويأكل ثم يشرب ثم يأتي بلازم ذاك هل هذا إله تعالى الله عن إفك النصارى سيسأل كلهم عما افتراه أعباد الصليب لأي معنى يعظم أو يقبح من رماه وهل تقضي العقول بغير كسر وإحراق له ولمن بغاه فيا عبد المسيح أفق فهذا بدايته وهذا منتهاه